So it's time for a long overdue update on the propagation experiment that I started last year with the ZZ plant and the natural rooting aid alternatives that you could use instead of the store-bought rooting powders. So I do have some results, but I wouldn't be confident in the reliability of those results due to some problems that I experienced with the experiment later in the year. So I will cover what those problems were, as well as the small number of results that I have, along with what I'd possibly do if I rerun that experiment again later in the year when we're in the active growing season. Here's a very quick recap of the experiment, just in case you haven't seen the original video or the previous update. Now, as I said, I was testing out rooting aid alternatives to those that you can buy in the store, and I wanted to find natural alternatives. So based on my research, I had found some that were meant to contain either antimicrobial properties, plant hormones to support propagation and root development, or possibly a mixture of the two. So I had 5 altogether. So I had willow water, coconut water, raw or Manuka honey, aloe vera gel and cinnamon powder. I then also used a control which had no rooting aid, so that was to test the effectiveness of the rooting aid alternatives I was using against those that had no rooting aid, plus using the store-bought rooting aid powder just as a comparison to the natural alternatives. So for the experiment, I obviously needed a lot of plant material to try and propagate, and I wanted to try and control the variables as much as possible. So I wanted the plant material to be as much the same as possible to obviously keep that control there. So I decided to use ZZ plants as I had a lot of them in the collection, plus they are quite prolific propagators, so you can propagate them from leaves, which made it really easy to get enough plant material for the experiment. So I had 7 ZZ plants, from which I took 7 leaves, so that was 1 for each of the rooting aids plus the control, and then that also allowed me, as I said, to control for potentially plant health if there were any real successes or failures. Was that due to the rooting aid that I was using, or was it anything to do with the different plants that I was using? So that just gave me another variable to check. Now, a little while after doing the original setup video, I did do an update video as there were some signs of how the leaves were doing with the different rooting aids. So the coconut water was in the last place at that point with 2 failed leaves. The willow water and the raw or Manuka honey had 1 failed leaf each, so they were in second place, and then the aloe vera had 1 sad looking leaf. It wasn't quite failed, but it didn't look the best either, so it was kind of on its way out. Whereas the cinnamon powder and the control and store-bought powder all had 100% of their leaves still looking green and healthy at that point. So what went wrong? As I said, I was trying to control the different variables. As you might see if you do watch the original video or have done, I put the different leaves in the clear containers so I could see if roots were developing. I could hopefully see how much moisture was in the pot, or as might not be the case, as we'll come to that in just a second. And during the summer, if you are from the UK, you may remember last year we had 1 or 2 very, very hot spells, heat waves that were incredibly hot. I possibly even record breaking for the country, if you remember, and all of the plants were struggling during that time. And obviously with propagations, they are more delicate than the established plants when it comes to heat spells or even other worsening conditions. So I found that maybe quite challenging to keep up with the watering, because what I didn't want to do is put too much water in the pot and then possibly risk root rot, not root rot because they don't have any roots, but risk rotting the propagations because they're sitting in damp soil as opposed to just moist soil, but also the quickness or speed of which they were drying out during those heat spells, it possibly wasn't the best for them. So it was actually after those different heat spells that I started to notice more of the plants dying back. As you can see, lots of dried out leaves. So that was a mixture of maybe the harsh conditions during those hot times, but also my ability to keep up with maintaining the moisture for these propagations. So I think a lesson learned from this is if I do rerun the experiment in the active growing season this year, then what I might do if we have any more of those heat spells, which I'm sure we will, it's just a natural part of our summers now, what with climate change and everything like that, the temperatures do seem to be rising. So with this type of experiment, I would probably move the propagations to, if I can find a cooler part of the house during those heat spells, and maybe use something like a moisture meter or a better way to track and monitor the moisture levels in the soil so that I am not inadvertently failing the experiment myself. That being said, I do still have some leaves, a very small number of leaves out of the amount that I tried, that did survive, so I'll cover those off next. Now this might be a moot point given the problems that I've just explained with the experiment, but I did think in theory there should have been some of the rooting aid alternatives that would have stood out above the others based on the properties that they had. So I mentioned earlier they should have had either antimicrobial properties, plant hormones, or both. So with the different ones that I had, the aloe vera, the store-bought powder and the willow water should have had both, so they in theory should have been the most effective. The coconut water only had the plant hormones, so that would have supported in that way. The raw or Manuka honey and the cinnamon powder was antimicrobial but did not contain plant hormones, so that one was maybe the least effective compared to the others. And then lastly, the control, which had no rooting aid alternative, again in theory should have been the least effective because that had no rooting aid at all supporting the propagations. So we'll start with the ones that have failed completely with no leaves that have survived, and the two first ones are the ones with only single beneficial properties in terms of propagation. So the honey, which was antimicrobial, and the coconut water, which contained plant hormones. Both of those all have no surviving leaves, but there are also two more. So these other two are perhaps the surprising ones that didn't make it, again, albeit the problems with the experiment, but the shop store-bought powder, which should have had the plant hormones in and I would guess the antimicrobial properties, that one has completely failed as well. And the willow water, which should have had both of the beneficial properties, did not survive, or none of the leaves survived in that one either. But now let's move on to the ones that did have some surviving leaves. So these two are in joint second place, as these two both have a healthy leaf still remaining in the pot, and even though the soil is a little bit loose in these pots, I've given them a gentle tug and they have remained in the soil, so they are anchored, which means they should have roots. So the first one is the cinnamon powder, which was only antimicrobial. That has, as you can see, a very nice healthy green leaf in there, and that's doing well. And then, interestingly, the control, which had no rooting aid, that still has a nice green healthy leaf on there. So that is probably the one that I would have expected to fail out of all of them, albeit the problems with the experiment that we have had. That one is one that I would have expected not to survive compared to all of the others. So that is from plant 5 and this one is from plant 7. So I've got another one with 2 leaves surviving in it, and we'll see what plants they come from too. So in first place, and only based on the limited results that I've got, is the aloe vera gel. So this one is one of those that I would have thought would be most effective, as it did have the plant hormones and antimicrobial properties. Now, one of these leaves in particular doesn't look the best at the moment, but it is anchored in the soil, as is this one too. So I have topped up these with some moisture, so hopefully they will be okay. But this one has 2 surviving leaves, and this one is from plant 1 and this one is from plant 4, so all from different plants as well, out of those different leaves that have survived. So maybe the plant differences didn't really have anything to do with the effectiveness of the propagations, but again, the problems that I've experienced with the experiment have possibly made those unreliable, as I would have expected from 49 leaves there should have been a lot more successful propagations from that. I should be sitting here with lots more ZZ plants than I already had, at least little ones, from those leaves that were propagated. Now it is only early in the year and very, very cold, so I'll wait until we're in the active growing season again and reset up that experiment to run it again, but this time I will be more conscious of tracking the watering and maintaining the moisture in the soil, as well as making sure that I'm being conscious of the different temperature levels if we do happen to have a heat wave, that I am moving the different propagations into hopefully a cooler spot if I can find it, so that they are less affected by those external factors, and I can then hopefully get more reliable results that I can share with you on what natural rooting aid alternatives work above or in addition to the rooting aid powders or gels that you can buy from the store. Now I hope you found that update useful, particularly if you have followed from the original setup of the experiment. I will link the original video at the end if you haven't watched it, as you might want to learn more about those different rooting aid alternatives that I've suggested, as I share more about them in that video, so you can watch that next if you wish to. If you have found this video interesting, then please do subscribe, as I will run the experiment again later in the year, as I said, but this time with a bit more control over the external factors as well. And if you do like plant content, then again subscribe, as I've got lots of videos on the channel and we'll have new ones every week. If you've got any questions or comments, please do put them below and I'll respond to everyone. And as always, thank you for watching Grow Your Wellbeing.